Hello, my name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions.
And I'm Proven Paradox, a guy with a lot of questions.
And you're listening to Bright on Buddhism, a podcast where we discuss East Asian Buddhism, answering listener-submitted questions from listeners just like you, and introducing concepts of Buddhism that you may or may not be familiar with in a casual, conversational setting. Enjoy. Hermit, have you ever had a dream that you were so sure was real that you woke up confused and perhaps doubting whether you had woken up at all?
I have. It's not every night, but on occasion I have vivid, detailed dreams. Through them I've been to heaven, hell, and everything in between. Why do you ask?
The Buddha's disciples have discussed visions and dreams a great deal, and I begin to wonder about their nature. The Buddha teaches non-duality, which implies that the events of dreams and visions and the events of waking life are indistinct from each other, at least in terms of how they are both transient and illusory.
That's an interesting idea. Would that mean that we are to understand the events of dreams to be no less true than those in waking life?
I don't think so, but neither are they truly real in the sense that they concern or possess something that abides permanently and substantially. Dreams and waking life are both equally subject to causes and conditions, and thus are karmic and empty. However, this does not mean that we experience them any less. They happen, just not in the way that we think they do.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Bright on Buddhism. This week we will be discussing visions and dreams in Buddhism. What is the role of visions and dreams in Buddhism? What are some visions and dreams that Buddhists have had? How ought we understand them? How are they different from imagining a thing? We hope you enjoy. So, what is the role of visions and dreams in Buddhism?
I'm really excited to discuss this question because this is something that fascinates me a great deal and represents a potentially viable question for many levels of research, ranging from introductory all the way up to the dissertation level. Dreams and visions are super fascinating, even in a modern Western context. People interpret dreams to be anything from random firings of our brains as they clean house, to divine messages from outside and far away, and everything in between. There's still so much that neuroscientists do not understand about what they are and how they work. Visions are similarly fascinating because they are interpreted as anything from symptoms of a mental illness to prophetic prescience, a spectrum just as wide as with dreams. In the Buddhist context, it becomes even more interesting because visions and dreams are one of the very few things that play a universal role in Buddhism regardless of time or place in history. However, the context and understanding of visions and dreams are nevertheless unique to each time and place. So let's get into it. To define our terms, we're going to define dreams as the audiovisual hallucinations that take place while one is asleep, and we're going to define visions as audiovisual hallucinations that take place while one is awake. In our modern Western vernacular, I think the defining aspect is whether or not one is asleep, because dreams are normal occurrences, while visions are far less common and potentially very concerning. Depending on who you ask, they can be regarded as the result of an overactive imagination, symptoms of a serious illness that requires urgent medical attention, or as indicators that somebody has some sort of connection between this realm and another through which messages are being delivered. In Buddhism, visions and dreams are regarded as indistinct from each other except for the aspect of sleep, and there is rarely, if ever, a connotation of illness or psychosis in the case of visions. To begin with, I would like to state that the Buddha does not preach directly on the topic of visions and dreams in the sutras, but he does mention them, and many treatises that come out later discuss them in more detail. One of the most important things that the Buddha says about dreams is that a monk cannot act as a dream reader or a diviner of dreams. I think this is fascinating given that interpretation of dreams is very important to later Buddhists, though not in a grifty and transactional way as the Buddha likely intended with that statement. To understand dreams and visions, let's first return to the concept of non-duality, which we discussed all over the show. Basically, non-duality is a Mahayana elaboration of the middle way. Reality is neither one extreme or the other. It is both extremes and neither. Take language as an example. Our words and speech are inherently unwholesome, dualistic, and subject to dukkha. It's possible for language to be a source of pleasure and pain, and thus a source of desire, and thus a source of attachment. So, language could be seen as quote-unquote bad. However, the Buddha taught with speech and words, and we consume the sermons in written or spoken form to this day. Therefore, language is a potential vehicle for enlightenment, and kind, skillful, and/or delightful words are potential causes for realizations on the path of enlightenment. Thus, it's also possible to regard language as quote-unquote good. The reality is that comprehensively, language is both good and bad. Both states are possible. There is evil speech and enlightening speech. Underlying this is the idea that language is inherently subject to emptiness. The sounds of spoken words themselves and the relationships that those sounds have to the thing they indicate is subject to emptiness as well. Neither extreme of good or bad is true or possible because it's all impermanent and illusory. However, its being transient and illusory does not mean that we don't use it every day. While the emptiness of language is true, it still exists conventionally. Thus, you'll see a common formula given for non-duality and emptiness. Good, bad, both, neither, neither, both, nor neither. I'm going back over all of that again because I want to emphasize that the events that take place in visions and dreams are regarded in the exact same way. In other words, there is no thought process like we have in the modern era that states the things we experience while awake actually did happen, and the things that we experience in a dream or vision did not happen, or weren't real. The events of a dream or a vision have a non-dual relationship with the events of waking life. All events, whether experienced in a dream, a vision, or a lucid waking moment, are equally real, unreal, both real and unreal, and neither real nor unreal. As a result, the events of dreams and visions are given more credence than we would give them in the West in the modern era. Some of them can be seen as messages or visitations from the Buddha or from a bodhisattva, but usually only if they meet some requirements. Not just any dream is a message or a visitation from the Buddha. Certain common events in dreams or visions people have had across history come to be regarded as visitations from the Buddha. For example, the Buddha is often seen and his skin is described as purple gold, and he's sitting or standing on a purple cloud that he rides into and out of the dream. You can already see that there's some dreamy imagery going on here. What color is purple gold? I can't say I've ever seen it. And I don't mean gold metal that has been painted or chemically treated or alloyed to look purple. I mean the color purple gold that is somehow a mixture between the two colors. Furthermore, have you ever seen somebody with that skin color? Obviously, this is referring to how his skin is special and different from the average person's. Also, the purple cloud is fascinating. Sometimes the cloud is different colors, so I don't think that purple is super significant, but it is mentioned nonetheless. Sometimes the Buddha or the Bodhisattva in these dreams or visions also speak. This is fascinating as well. Sometimes their voices are described as great, thunderous, booming voices, and sometimes they sound like bells, tinkling crystals, or birdsong. Sometimes they also speak without moving their mouths, or when they open their mouths, music comes out instead of words. Some practitioners are also known to have visions during meditation. Here my cynicism will show. In some treatises that come about long after the sutras, there are different descriptions of meditative visions that occur during a given type of meditation. One example is the awakening of faith in the Mahayana, known in Chinese as the Dashang Qixin Lun. Though this is usually attributed to the 2nd century CE Indian thinker Ashvaghosha, no Sanskrit version has ever been found, and it is widely regarded by many scholars as having been composed in China. It's my plan to read and discuss this treatise now that we've started doing treatises as well as sutras very soon. One of the sections of the Awakening of Faith is talking about meditating on faith, and so it mentions visions people may have as cautionary tales. The treatise cautions you that during meditation, you may have moments where figures will come around and congratulate you on attaining the highest realization, but these figures are actually agents of Mara trying to get you to stop meditating and to rest on your laurels and indulge in sensory desires and indulgences. My cynicism comes about when we talk about the forms these figures can take. Sometimes they're disembodied voices, sometimes they're godlike men and women who can't really be described, but also sometimes they are quote-unquote beautiful children. In some translations, there's a very sexual overtone that is really unpleasant to read. In other words, the treatise says to be careful when meditating because sometimes quote-unquote beautiful children will show up and adorn you with flowers and clothes and ornaments and say that you have attained perfect enlightenment. But what they're really trying to do is tempt you back into sensuality and prevent you from finishing your task, which is to attain satori, or sudden meditative realization of some kind. For more on satori, visit episode 97, What is Satori?, which will be linked in the show notes. My cynicism shows because the sexual overtone of it all makes me suspect extremely unkind things from whoever experienced this. We'll dive more into that mess whenever we read and discuss the Awakening of Faith. Note that not all meditative visions are bad, either. Sometimes Satori can be a multi-sensory experience. In addition to a mental realization, people can also see Buddhas or Bodhisattvas, and sometimes those figures have messages. The local monk at my temple claims to have had one such vision when he was visiting the Ellora Caves in India, a lesser-known Buddhist pilgrimage site with statues and carvings adorning the inside of a mountain cave. The Buddha appeared to him and said to him, "Let all beings dance, let all beings be comfortable, let all beings be happy." We can discuss more about this in the following question as well.
What are some visions and dreams that Buddhists have had?
Let's start with dreams. As we've discussed, there are many kinds of dreams that have a Buddhist context or significance. One of the largest records or repositories of dreams comes from the Ōjōyōshū, or the Essentials of Rebirth in the Pure Land. This was authored by the Pure Land monk Genshin in 985 AD, and its purpose is to instruct people in how to attain rebirth in Amida's Pure Land. Most importantly for this episode, it provides reports of various dreams and visions people had after somebody had died. These allegedly verified that their practice had worked and that the deceased had attained rebirth in the Pure Land. Genshin knew that people would ask him, "You say that all these practices work, but how do you really know?" And his answer was, "Here are records of dreams about people I know practice Nenbutsu and visualization correctly, which prove that these practices worked for them." The reason this was taken as valid evidence is what I mentioned before. Dreams were regarded as fairly indistinct from real events that actually happened. There are lots of cases where people with a relationship to a recently deceased individual will have a dream or a vision where the Buddha visits them, sometimes taking the hand of the dying or dead person, sometimes bringing the dreamer with them on a cloud to visit the loved one, or sometimes telling the dreamer that the deceased person made it and is a bodhisattva. Sometimes they'll also dream that the deceased person leaves this realm for the Pure Land on a cloud or a lotus blossoming, and this will be enough verification that the person had made it. This is all related to the idea of Raigo, or a vision one has at the moment of death where the Buddha visits the dying person to invite them into the Pure Land. Depending on which of the 9 levels of rebirth they're being born into, either Amida himself will be there, or Kannon, or just some of his attendants. For more on the 9 levels and on Raigo, check out our reading and discussion of the Contemplation Sutra, which will be linked in the show notes. These dreams have a couple of functions. One is as a verification that something has occurred. They act as a receipt for all the ritual and practical exertions the living person and the deceased persons did to facilitate the deceased person's rebirth in the Pure Land. In this way, they assuage anxieties and uncertainties around death and what happens after. Imagine that somebody very close to you had just died, and you're naturally feeling all of the grief and anxiety that comes with that. My family was never raised super religious, so when family members have died in the past, we have not worried over what happens after. But when my grandmother died, she was uniquely close to me and my immediate family, and my sister, who was 30 at the time, was so impacted by it that she was resorting to Googling what happens to people when they die. She was so worried about our grandmother that she was trying to answer the question, where is she now? This is not a unique experience. People who lose loved ones feel this way all the time, even if they are raised with a very certain idea of what happens after death. So imagine you're feeling this way, and then you or somebody close to you has a dream about the deceased person that you interpret to be a sure indicator that they went to the Pure Land, the very best of all realms available to you. That would undoubtedly make you feel much, much better. Many hypothesize that one of the many real-world functions of religion is to ameliorate the fear of death, and in this case, Buddhism serves that purpose to the letter. What makes it interesting is that dreams can serve that function in Buddhism, while they don't in other religious traditions, or at least not so directly. Dreams can serve other functions as well, such as verifying the perceived truth or reality of the doctrines one has been taught. In the case where you have a dream that somebody is reborn into the Pure Land, or you witness a Buddha or a Bodhisattva visit you or the deceased, that undoubtedly reinforces your faith that the Pure Land, Amida, Bodhisattvahood, and all the rest of the Mahayana teachings are all actually true. Now let's move to visions. Visions fascinate me in Buddhism because they can be red herrings that serve to mislead or tempt practitioners, or they can also serve a function similar to dreams, verification, or as proof that Satori has occurred, and it's up to the practitioner to know the difference. Visions during meditation has a practical layer that dreams do not have. Oftentimes, the meditative practice in question is to visualize the Buddha, their realm, or something pertaining to them. It's easy to see the potential for this practice to cause one to have visions, or even for thinking that having visions is the end goal. In some traditions, this visualization is indeed meant to be a sort of communion with the Buddha. When you visualize him and see him in your mind, you aren't making a hologram of him in your brain. He is actually thought to be there. The visualization is actually him there with you, communing with you. Thus, there is the aspect of this practice that you are perfecting the practice of communing with the Buddha, but also with bodhisattvas, gods, and other holy figures. Doing this creates a karmic connection with the Buddha, which spans many eons of time. By having this relationship and by communing with the Buddha as often as possible, you're creating opportunities for him to preach to you and for him to prophesy your future Buddhahood, both of which are necessary events for somebody to become a Buddha, according to many Mahayana traditions. However, as we mentioned before, there are cases where a person can be tempted off the path as they're practicing certain types of meditation, and it's said that it is very hard to tell the difference between that which is really divine and that which is meant to dupe or tempt you. This mainly pertains to meditation on an idea, such as faith or emptiness, rather than a visualization of a figure, but it's still part of that practice to see the Buddha at some point. As the fruits of your exertions, you're visited by the Buddha who preaches to you and prophesies your future Buddhahood in a moment that is characterized as satori. But as we said, you can be tempted by evil figures once you're very close to attaining super high realizations. Records of visions are harder to grasp because they're part of a practice in many ways, but these are still examples of the types of visions that people can have.
How ought we understand visions and dreams? How are they different from imagining a thing?
This is a question that I often have when I read about this sort of thing. Because of the non-dual relationship between the events of visions and/or dreams and those of waking life, what about things we imagine? Indeed, there is an answer. When we imagine a thing, that is mental karma or mental action. We also have bodily actions and verbal actions. These are all also karmic, or they're also karma. If you remember from episode 4, What is Karma, which will be linked in the show notes, one of the translations and usages of the word karma is to stand in for the word action. So when we imagine a thing, when we come up with a thought, that is a karmic action, subject to being good, bad, or neutral karma. Because thoughts are understood in Buddhism to be karmic, they can either be volitional, as in we intentionally have them and create karma, or they can be involuntary, as in a case where we experience the fruits of our karma, or somebody else's karma, as a thought. So involuntary thoughts of all kinds are regarded as being connected or tied to our karmic situation, which is very victim-blaming for people with mental illnesses. Visions and dreams are tied to our karma as well, but they're not understood to be volitional, even if they are understood to be part or even the goal of meditative practice. They're karmic fruits of past action, so their nature, be it tempting and insidious or divine and wholesome, is determined by our karmic situation. In other words, if you're shown tempting visions that are meant to distract you and prevent you from a given realization, it's because you have not perfected or purified your bad karma, or your karma in general. You haven't perfected or purified your practice, or your mind. In the awakening of faith, it is encouraged that one cultivates discernment, or otherwise sticks to the practice, even if they have these visions, because it's up to the practitioner whether or not they fall victim to the temptation and the distraction of evil visions. Thus, we are instructed to perfect our practice and purify our minds, and if we do so, we are said to have the correct visions. Visions in Buddhism are rarely prophetic on a wider scale. In other words, Buddhists will not usually have visions with contents that predict stuff, and that doesn't immediately concern enlightenment and Buddhahood. Buddhists do not typically have visions of the end of the world, or of specific events of the future, as adherents of other religious traditions might claim to have. As I said before, there are obviously moments where the Buddha predicts a practitioner's future Buddhahood, but the Buddha won't predict, there will be a flood here in 2 weeks, or anything like that. Usually the visions are meant to clarify something or give the practitioner a realization about practice and doctrine. For example, we briefly mentioned in our solo research project episode on Aikido that Ueshiba Morihei had a vision of a great spirit of peace that explained to him the nature of Budo, or the proper martial lifestyle. In that vision, the spirit essentially preached nonviolence and compassion to him. Of course, he did not see a Buddha, but this could still be understood to be a Buddhist vision because of the nature of what the spirit preached to him. In this case, there was no prophecy of specific events in the future. It was a clarification of a teaching.
We hope you enjoyed this week's discussion of visions and dreams in Buddhism. Join us next week where we will be discussing the famous Buddhist thinker Kumaro-jiva. Who is Kumaro-jiva? What did he do in his life? How does that affect Buddhism in East Asia? We hope to see you there. Thank you for listening.
Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time.
If you like our show and would like to support us, we ask that you instead send that generous support to a worthy cause. Currently, that is easing the weaponized famine that is tearing through Gaza. Because of blockades, charities and aid organizations can't do much. The best we can do is directly donate to GoFundMe campaigns or the like. For now, we're pointing at the page for Tashneem Mahmood, a mother of 3 who has lost her apartment in the bombing. If you are able, please send some support her way.
My name is Nick Bright, scholar of East Asian religions and the voice of Hearer.
And I'm Docs, editor, question asker, and voice of Hermit.
And this has been Bright on Buddhism. Thank you for listening. If you like our podcast, or if you have any questions that you'd like us to discuss, we'd love to hear from you. Please consider leaving a comment, review, or subscribing. You can also reach us by email at bright.on.buddhism@gmail.com. As always, citations and resources for this episode can be found in the show notes. Thank you.